Drive Time on BCFM, 5 till 7 on 93.2 FM.
Well, in Frome last night there was a Frome Stop the War group talk looking at the mainstream media's effect on the war on terror. And I spoke to writer for the New Statesman and The Guardian on the Arab Spring, Dan Glazebrook.
My name is Dan Glazebrook, here to give a talk today on humanitarian interventionism, so-called, and the use of human rights as a propaganda weapon by the West in waging war.
But I mean, there is genuine concerns for human rights, particularly in Mali at the moment, aren't there?
Yeah, of course. Of course there are genuine concerns. But what we've seen time and again is that these interventions result in creating failed states with the breeding ground for the worst human rights abuses you can imagine. If you look at Iraq, for example, now, these barely a day goes by when you don't get, 5, 10, 15, 20, up to 80 people sometimes killed in bombings. And this has been the case for years and years now in Iraq. And you're seeing similar with the covert or sometimes overt intervention, proxy intervention in Syria. You're seeing the same in Libya. You see the same in Afghanistan. So the idea that, the West's intervention somehow actually in any sense improve the human rights situation in these countries, well, you just need to look at the historical record, even just recently, to see that's clearly not true.
But I mean, Syria particularly, we've seen for the last, couple of years, we've seen an appalling acts by the regime there against people who have simply had enough of the regime. We had a revolution in this country back in the 1600s. Surely that's a legitimate wish for the people to overthrow their government when they see that, or they decide for themselves that these people are not ruling us well. There's many countries in the world where that actually might end up possibly being a good thing.
Yeah, in every country there are issues and problems, and people have their grievances and their demands. But what we saw happening very quickly in Syria was that these peaceful protests, such as there were very quickly overtaken by armed elements, often outsiders, who were funded and equipped by Western allies like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. Trained, we now know there are reports of SAS training camps on the border in Turkey that are training people, sending them in. We know there have been boatloads of fighters that were used by NATO as proxies in Libya, Libyan fighters going over to Syria. So the idea that this whole what's become a civil war is just an issue of a dictator stamping out peaceful protest movement is nonsense. It's very quickly become a civil war with active intervention from many outside forces. And it's now admitted openly, it's been eventually admitted in the mainstream press more and more frequently, that the main fighting forces are these kind of Salafi militias that are from outside the country. And actually, if you look at some of the groups like the National Coordination Committees that played quite an active role at the beginning of the protests against Assad's government, they're increasingly angry at the West for funding these movements that have hijacked their own movement. And they increasingly condemn the militarization of the uprising. So it's certainly, in their eyes, this wasn't some kind of natural response to a brutal crackdown. This was something that's been imposed and foisted on them from the outside.
Now, just this week, we've seen all sorts of traumatic stuff going on in Libya. One of the main opposition leaders actually being assassinated, shot dead, and massive trauma in the country. We've had a long-term state of emergency that was running throughout the end of last year as well. Now, this was supposedly holding a candle for the Arab Spring, being the first country where the Arab Spring happened. What does this tell us about, maybe what's going to happen in other countries as the Arab Spring plays out not over months, but over years?
The whole concept of the Arab Spring really needs to be kind of thoroughly analysed and investigated, I think. There was certainly predictions for a long time of that there was going to be unrest in a lot of Middle Eastern countries and over a lot of North Africa, particularly in places like Egypt, where you have this combination of a kind of growing youthful population. You have wide-scale unemployment. Obviously, you've got rising prices. There were food riots, for several years before the so-called Arab Spring got underway. So there were predictions that there was going to be this kind of unrest, and I think we have to say that the West planned for this very well. and managed to get its strategy in place. And its strategy was, if its people are going to be challenged in, if it's kind of, it's, I wouldn't call Mubarak a puppet, and I wouldn't have called Ben Ali a puppet, but certainly his allies in places like Tunisia and Egypt, if they're going to be challenged by a mass movement, which I think they were, then the West realized, well, we have to have a plan B. And they had their plan B in the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been cultivated by British intelligence for decades and decades as a force against secular nationalism, which for a long time has been their real worry, as a kind of organized, secular, genuine force for independence. So that's their plan B for those countries. And the other part of their plan was, okay, well, this can be the perfect excuse to try and topple long-standing foes of the West in places like Syria and Libya.
But, I mean, Tunisia's been out of the news for a couple of years now. I mean, it was big a couple of years ago. Almost nothing about Tunisia. Suddenly, it's back in the news as the entire country erupts into chaos this week. There's been, tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people out on the street. And one of the things we've learned is that when the regime decides it's going to turn off the internet, switch off Facebook and the social networking, people seem to just come out on the street instead. It's almost most counterproductive.
Yeah, quite. It's an interesting look to Tunisia. It has been out of the news, but it's played a very important role in the problems that have been coming about in Mali, according to a recent report on, I think it's Jamestown Foundation, looking at basically the collapse of Libya and saying, actually, it's not just Libya, but this is extending this kind of ruled by militias, kind of militias taking control of different local areas. It's not just happening in Libya and Mali, it's happening in Tunisia as well. And we've seen in Tunisia, attacks on, even on pro-Palestinian, important pro-Palestinian political forces by Salafi militias on the grounds that they support Hezbollah, who's the Shia enemy, and so on. So there's a lot of this sectarianism is becoming very widespread, very prevalent in the so-called Arab Spring countries. And again, if you look at the role of the West, and especially Saudi Arabia, the West key ally in the region, has for a long time supported the growth of this sectarianism as the classic kind of divide and rule strategy. If you look at Britain, under the British Empire, they specifically cultivated families like the Saudi royal family, families like the Qatari royal family and the Bahraini royal family, because their particular brand of Islam was so sectarian and so intolerant of other elements of Islam, and they've been funding this kind of interpretation of Islam across these other countries for a long time, and now it's starting to, unfortunately, to bear fruit. And you're seeing these sectarian attacks by these long-term Saudi-funded groups, and this is, of course, this is ideal for the West, that for a long time has seen as united Arabia as fundamentally opposed to its interests. So, of course, it's supporting these sectarian forces, and this is unfortunately what we're seeing playing out.
Ultimately, though, there's a bit of a geostrategic battle in Africa as a whole for resources between the West and China. This is a bit of a wild card question, Dan, but who do you think is going to win that?
My understanding of history is that when it comes to a battle between a strong economy versus a strong military can only keep you afloat for so long. And unfortunately, what we're seeing, the other thing that we see is once the kind of basis of world power is undercut, that's when the holders of it start to rely more and more on their military. And we're seeing this. We're seeing with the decline of the West actually to bribe and use financial blackmail. Increasingly, they're turning to military means. So, for example, when we see things like the beginnings of the potential creation of things like an African monetary fund, Libya had promised $10 billion for that. That's now been seized by the American government. Algeria had promised $16 billion as well. It had an initial startup fund commitment from various African countries of $42 billion. you think that the IMF was able to bleed that continent dry over a couple of decades with only $25 billion fund, then you realize what a predicament the West's in if it's trying to exploit through solely economic and financial manipulation. It can't do that anymore, and especially with China on the scene, offering deals like a $9 billion virtually interest-free loan to Congo recently to provide, thousands of miles of infrastructure in terms of not just roads, but hospitals, cheap housing, and so on and so forth. The West can't compete with that on the economic level, so it's turning more and more to its military, and that's what we're seeing across North Africa and across West Africa now. But ultimately, I don't think that's sustainable. I don't think because as we've seen, you can only ever... Occupation breeds resistance. Military onslaught doesn't win you any friends. It might fool some people temporarily. If you look what they're doing with Mali, they've created this problem in Mali by equipping and funding and training these rebels in Libya, who then spread out and destabilize the region. It's like a classic mafia protection racket. How's the mafia work? You offer them protection the same way that Africom, the US African Command, tried to get African countries to host its bases when it was created 2007, 2008. If this offer of protection is refused, you make problems for these countries. You send in, as France, Britain and US have done, they've sent now into West Africa terrorist groups, and they say, right, okay, now do you want some protection? And of course some people are begging for it now. But how long they're going to tolerate it once it comes clear the nature of this protection is another story. So I think it's unsustainable in the long term. But the lesson we also learned from the last 2 years of the Second World War is that the worst damage is done once the point of no return has been reached. Once the Nazis are in retreat is when they did most of the worst damage. So that's why we really need to be vigilant, I think, in this period of imperialist decline is when the worst violence is likely to be committed. But it's unsustainable and it won't win.
That was Dan Glazebrook there, writer for the New Statesman and The Guardian. Old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers, what do you think about what he's saying there, that he believes actually that the Chinese possibly may win in Africa because the West and NATO particularly are taking a very militaristic approach?
Well, that's the way the Chinese like to play it. They would rather offer you a better deal than send their army to fight you. I mean, there was talk in China of sending the Chinese People's Liberation Army to stand beside Gaddafi, but wiser counsels prevailed. Softly, softly, catchy monkey.
Okay, thanks very much. Time to go and sign off now, but that's just the start of your Friday night talk radio extravaganza, because coming up next, the all-live, typical topical Afro-tropical show. Get ready to dial 0117 955 3721 to join Cyrus the Virus and the next level. Thanks very much to our guest in the first hour. That was Conservative Councillor for Westbury-on-Trim. Not just that, though, but also Bristol's Deputy Mayor, Jeff Gollop. Also thanks to Daphne Havercroft from the South West Whistleblowers Health Action Group and Mike Birkin from South West Friends of the Earth. Also, of course, you just heard there, Old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers. Thisweek.org.uk will take you straight to this show's links and our archives. Every BCFM show is available online. Just go to bcfm.org.uk, or even easier, thisweek.org.uk for this specific show. You can follow my Twitter feed in between shows at Tony Gosling, and the BCFM Twitter feed is at BCFM Radio. So I'm Tony Gosling, wishing you a relaxing and enjoyable weekend.